So we're gonna talk about Robb Stark and how he ruined his whole career. Because out of all the characters that ruined their whole careers in A Song of Ice and Fire, Robb Stark is a special case because I actually sympathized for him. And it is a shame that he made a couple of mistakes that were so apparent, that were extremely easy to fix, but for some reason, just as his father Ned, Robb continued on continued on to make rather obvious errors that obviously and apparently he continued on to make mistakes and errors that were apparent that they would harm his career. But let's get to it. In A Storm of Swords, we don't see Robb for a while. He's out there, he's being the king in the north, he's fighting the Lannisters and their allies, and he's on the field basically. But after a while, he comes back. We catch up to him. And the first thing that Caitlin of all people, she is the one to notice and inform us that Robb has no longer he doesn't have his direwolf Grey Wind by his side. Now that is a terrible problem. The moment I read it in the book, it filled me with anxiety because we all know the Stark children and the dire wolves go hand in hand. They're all connected. They have this bond, on a spiritual level, whatever. And here comes good old Robb, and his dire wolf is nowhere to be found. And even Caitlin is a bit angsty because of this. And the reason for this, if I remember correctly, is that Greywind, first of all, Greywind had a problem with the Freys that were around, right? For obvious reasons. But if I remember correctly, Greywind also had a problem with the Westerlings. Or correct me if I'm wrong, but either Greywind had a problem with the Westerlings or the Westerlings were afraid of Greywind, and because Robb had made them part of the family, he had to push Greywind aside. Now, here is where we talk about his second major mistake. The Westerlings, more precisely, Jane Westerling. She just pops out of nowhere. Robb has been wounded in battle, and here pops Jane Westerling. She tends to his wounds, and would you know it, because Robb almost died because they were on a battlefield because he is young, 15 years old, a relationship starts and he falls madly in love and he sleeps with Jane Westerling, and because he is his father's son, he pledges to marry her to preserve her honor. And because of this, a terrible problem arises because Caitlin had already promised that Robb would marry a Frey girl for the alliance with House Frey. And we all know that Walder Frey is a old grumpy shithead that is very sensitive when it comes to insults and so forth, right? But anyway, because Robb is young, yada yada, he delivers this great insult upon House Frey, and House Frey skedaddles. So now House Frey is no longer an ally, but now we have House Westerling. And from what I understand, House Westerling, even though they are an old noble house, they're pretty much insolvent, bankrupt, right? But regardless of the obvious setbacks and consequences that will obviously come down on Robb and his allies by insulting and losing House Frey, Robb persists. He insists. And from what I remember, Caitlyn doesn't really say anything about this. Um, she doesn't criticizes him, which is a bad move on Caitlyn's part. But I would say that these are the two big mistakes that Robb Stark makes that unavoidably arise and arrive and ruin his whole career. And the greatest tragedy of all is that all of this could have been easily avoided, right? He could have married a Frey girl, and then he could have had Jane Westerling as his mistress, right? He could have he could have altered things after the war had been won. He would have been king of the North and of the Riverlands, and maybe he could have negotiated with Walder Frey after the war had ended. But Robb, unfortunately, because of his youth, because of the, you know, emotions, because of the wounds, because of the battle, Jane Westerling by his side, tending to his wounds. It is unfortunate. It is unfortunate that this happens, and nobody steps up and tells him, "Yo, bro, listen, you gotta tread carefully now." Walder Frey, as nasty as he is, we need his army by our side to fight the Lannisters. But Robb, nobody tells him anything. Robb marries her, and House Frey leaves, and we know what happens. They join up with the Boltons and the Lannisters, and the Red Wedding happens. But unlike the show, Jane Westerling isn't present at the Red Wedding as she is in the show. But we're gonna insert a little caveat here. In the book, Robb and Jane underline and emphasize the fact that they've been trying to have a child. I mean, they were getting it on 24/7 basically, and there was no pregnancy. And this was mentioned repeatedly a couple of times, and it got me wondering because I watch a lot of theory videos and channels. A couple of them speculate that Jane Westerling might have been planted as a subversive agent by none other than Tywin Lannister. Because, as he says, Robb Stark is his father's son. Now, that line alone is suspicious. The fact that Robb and Jane don't have a child, she doesn't get pregnant, very suspect. Which makes me wonder, maybe Jane did something so that they wouldn't get pregnant if she is an agent of the Lannisters. If it is too, it is another bonus in terms of tragic overtones. Because Robb, as we know, he pretty much won every battle but lost the war because he had to get his tip wet, basically. And he didn't have the insight and the foresight to ponder the fact that this Jane situation could have been resolved and the Frey situation could have been resolved after the war had been won against the Lannisters, because he would have been king, a victorious king. And he just didn't. He jumped quickly and swiftly to marry Jane Westerling to preserve her honor because he is his father's son, allegedly. And nobody stopped him. Nobody told him anything. And the repercussions were extreme because of these two mistakes, keeping Grey Wind away from him for the sake of the Westerlings, and then, of course, marrying Jane Westerlings, which might be the enemy's agent, right? So he had won pretty much every battle, but he lost the war. And he wasn't defeated in battle. He wasn't, challenged to a duel. He just lost the war because he was young, because he was impetuous, and because he was his father's son in spirit, right? So that is how Robb Stark unfortunately ruined his whole career, and it is a tragedy. See ya.